Had quite a busy summer. That was just after the local elections, which saw the kind of trend of pretty unprecedented fragmentation in the vote continue. We've had quite a lot happen since. We've had the first and now second reading of the devolution bill, which many of you will know reverses the changes around first past the post that the Tories brought in on mayors. We've had an election strategy published by the government just before summer recess. And this evening, as I say, we've got quite a packed agenda. So we've got with us, we've got Lena and Stuart from Compass, who have just launched a new report, and they're going to be talking about that in a little bit. We're also going to share the latest on what we're doing in Parliament. And Joe's going to whiz through the National Commission terms of reference for a National Commission on electoral reform, which I'm sure many of you will be familiar with, but if you're not, you will be by the end of this meeting. So I think just to kind of kick us off, and we'll go through what we're doing at conference, which I'm sure many of you will be excited to hear about. So we've got a really great lineup of events and speakers this year. Just to start us off, I think we'll go to Compass first, who are going to tell us about their new report to the temper trap. So Lena and Stuart.
Thanks, Alex, and thanks everybody. Hi, for those of you who don't know me, I think I know most of you, but lots of familiar faces here. I'm Lena, I run the campaigns over at Compass, and we've been working on electoral reform, and I'm sure that we don't need to tell you guys that one of the most common responses we'd get from people on the street, but also politicians, was this idea that proportional systems let extremists in, whereas first past the post protects us against that. And Stuart has done some amazing work digging into how we can turn that myth on its head. So we're going to hear from him. We've got some slides. I also have a two-pager that I've made specifically for activists. I've made it for our Compass local groups, but I can share that at the end as well, so you don't have to take notes. You can have the key points in a Google Doc, and then I'll talk a little bit about other ways we can use this paper to try and make it as helpful as possible. But over to Stuart for the fun stuff.
Hey, thank you very much. Can everyone see my slides there? Is that on screen? Fantastic. Right. So listen, thank you very much, everyone, for giving me the opportunity to come and speak about this work I've been doing for the past 2 or 3 years. Some of it with Compass, motivated singularly by the ambition to try and help convince the British public that first past the post is a dangerous tool, and that proportional representation is a much better one, using the examples of the huge inequality gap that the UK faces today with respect to our peers on the mainland, and the consequent well-being challenges that has given us. And within that, one dedicated area has been, as Lena announced, looking at how proportional representation does a better job of managing the rise of the populist right across Europe. So just try and get my slide to move here. Right, so the first slide is an attempt to set out, in my mind, what I think is settled in the subconscious or the conscious of the people of the UK with respect to what's happening on the continent. That for the last 10 years, there have been not just rising power and interest in populist right parties in Europe, but we know that they are now in Parliament. And what I think that does is the way that gets played back by the establishment media in the UK is that people think that means they're in power in the way that parties take power in the UK, which is obviously majoritarian power. It's a big deal. You can see there the 5 countries that I've selected out of the 6 that are the basis of the work, that the populist right parties I'm citing there have achieved between 20 and up to almost 30% of the vote. And these parties are in power, but we know that that's in the PR environment. So that's different. We'll come on to that in a minute, but that's what's presented, and that's as far as we get. On the right-hand side of the slide, you can see the UK. We all know our populist party, has done better than it's ever done in the most recent election, but it only gets a fraction of seats, less than 1%. And this is why the public in the UK hold the view that first past the post is therefore better at managing away the threat posed by the populist right as articulated by a chap called Paul Holmes, Tory MP, in the Westminster debate on electoral reform in January. First past the post acts as a safeguard against extremism. So my work is intended to overturn this myth. The next slide, again, everybody will be familiar with this. Anybody that supports PR understands how it works, but it's worth just sort of indulging it. It just replays what I put on the first slide, and it's showing you that, in fact, these parties, whilst in government, and they're in coalition. Whilst the coalitions have majority power and are able to pass laws, therefore, none of the parties are so powerful that they can influence what they do themselves. It's the basic principle of everybody having to cooperate and everybody having to negotiate no one's manifesto from the election surviving intact into power. We thought it'd be useful just to sort of go through an example of probably one of the most recent examples of the populist right in Europe and how well they've been doing, which is the Dutch one. And we'll segue into just explaining some of the other things that never really get surfaced by the media in the UK, partially because of time, but again, probably ignorance to a great extent as well. Everybody will have heard about Geert Wilders. He's a sort of like Dutch Trump sort of character, big hair, charismatic, controversial, friends with Trump, friends with Orban, and leader of now the biggest party in the Netherlands. So the Netherlands appears to be amongst those other countries where the populist right seem to be doing well, even more terrifying, right? But in actual fact, you scratch the surface, you discover there are a lot of other things going on in the Netherlands, right? Now, let's be clear, the Netherlands is going through a crisis, arguably the most tension and stress and trauma it's experienced since the Second World War. But when you look at how the PR system handles that, it's very interesting. So on the left-hand side of the slide, you're presented there with the coalition of the four parties that are in government, right? They've just about 60%, so they can pass laws and execute the agenda agreed by the coalition. The top party is the smallest one. It's a single issue party. It's the Farmers' Party. It was only created 6 or 7 years ago, and its purpose is almost entirely to serve the needs of farmers that are dealing with a very heavy, anti-pollution regulations to do with nitrogen that comes from the livestock farming in the Netherlands. So they've got 7 seats. Now, again, we never really get single issue parties with any success in Parliament in the first past the post system. Second party is even younger. It was only formed in March 2023 by an old standing sort of like grandee of the sort of the Dutch political experience of the previous 20 years or so. His party is set up specifically to deal with serious frustration and anger in the Netherlands around a probity to do with government, a scandal where many people are wrongly accused of benefit fraud over about 10 or 12 years, and other things. That party, in the space of 9 months, not only got into power, it achieved 20 seats, which is quite remarkable. The third party in the coalition is an establishment party. It's the Dutch Conservative Party equivalent. It's the party of Mark Rutte before he went to NATO. It's the party that's blamed by the Dutch, certainly on the left, for many of the sort of neoliberal linked sort of challenges they've experienced in recent times. And then not last but least, the last party is the PVV, which is Wilders' party, the biggest party in Parliament and in the coalition. And its base is very typical of the populist movements across the mainland, slightly different to the UK in that very much the lower income, the disenfranchised, sort of like male, older population in rural areas that have been the base of its vote. That's typically how it's achieved about 10 to 12% of its vote in recent times until 23, when it achieved almost double that, where it was able to appeal to younger people in cities. Right? Why? All the noise is about immigration, but in actual fact, one of the real problem that most people experience, certainly young people, is housing. They can't rent, they can't buy. They've got a serious housing challenge. Okay, so effectively, you've got a coalition arrangement that's set up to deal with what I've set out here as core policies, these 3 areas, that's built on a radical mix of new parties, extremely new parties, and then some radical parties as well. So there are things in there that aren't nice, but it's a solution that's designed to deal with the specifics, right, of what's happening in the Netherlands. Very, very different from we experience, right? But segueing back into the core theme, the tempering of populism you can see in the far right, pardon the pun, that the real nasties, the things that people find most unpleasant, that you're most worried about, are removed. So the very aggressive ambitions of the PVV around migration, the idea of trying to take the NL out of Europe entirely. And then the last thing, arguably the most controversial, was that Wilders was denied the right to be Prime Minister. So Wilders, as leader of the biggest party in the coalition in the Netherlands and most countries, has the right to become Prime Minister. Denied on the basis that his behaviour, the allegations around his racist behaviour and so on, was not acceptable. So a lot of very interesting things happening there that you don't get anywhere near when you get this fed to you from the UK sort of establishment perspective. And it's not just the Netherlands, right? What you've got on this slide is the other 4 of the other 5 countries, just examples of exactly the same thing happening in their context, right? And it's all about this concept that the paper has surfaced and that Labour's, that we refer to as structural friction, which is basically the process that each party that gets into the coalition must go through. And that means that it has to compromise and, and temper and negotiate, whether they're populist or not, but obviously much more important when we're dealing with populist phenomena. I won't go through any of those, but they're talked about in detail in the paper. So the big deal here, then, you might say is, well, you could say all that to the UK audience, right? But how do they really get a sense of what that means, right? Already, they're not familiar with how PR works, how coalitions work, and so on. What does that mean? You're saying they're tempered. Well, here is probably the most important piece of evidence that they could relate to, and that is, how do these coalitions with these populist right parties fare when you compare them to recent legislation in the UK? So obviously, we have to look at the Tories up to 2024. And so in each of the 4 instances that we put on the previous slide to do with immigration, aggressive stance against EU and EU regulations, climate change and the economy, in each of those 4 instances, it's very easy to establish that our UK so-called centre-right party has implemented the more extreme populist measures, right, than any of those peers, right? And there are many other instances in the work that we talk about that. These are obviously some of the more spectacular and better known ones there. So why does this happen? It happens, and the report has a dedicated section on this, because of the phenomenon of co-optation, right? Why would it be that the Tories, that still get described as a centre-right party, end up somehow by the back door being more populist than these other countries where they have real populism, if you want, in power? Well, here's why. The UK and other work that I've been doing with Compass sort of demonstrates this. Has obviously it's been moving to the right. I think everybody knows that. We know that Blair had to move to the right. But more recently and more relevantly here, what happened under Cameron is where it really started, the sort of the populist journey. And we know why that was. That's because of the rise of UKIP and Euroscepticism. And the 5 sort of instances that are cited on that slide there are obvious examples that everybody will be familiar with. But they are the reason that the Tories had to bank continually to the right, to the extent that we end up with, the Rwanda measures of the last couple of years under the Tories. But what's most significant here is that the co-optation, the phenomenon of co-optation happens because the Tories have to move because they fear they're going to lose ground to their right flank. And the amazing thing is that Farage and UKIP and Reform, without any power, right, 1 or 2 seats that actually were never really actually their seats, they were defective Tory seats, has been able to drive all this over the last 15 years to the extent that we then end up even more radical than these other countries, in which case you can see, the reverse is the case of what our friend, the Tory MP, said in Parliament in January during that debate.
Thanks,
And
Stuart. Oh, you're not done. Nope,
well,
my
I'm
bad.
not done, but I mean, I can shut up if we've been running long enough.
No, on you go.
I'll just quickly run through. I mean, I think everybody's familiar with this, but we've gone so far to the right that this chart just replays what we saw at the beginning, with the spectre of UKIP now achieving 35% will be enough to give them a majority, which would make, in our situation, the UK the first country to have a sort of single party majority, populist party in power. And that would mean that then, assuming Reform continue their 2024 manifesto agenda, that we've got even more extreme measures than the already most extreme populist arrangement in Europe under the Tories. And there we have it. And that's it. So these just 4 points at the end, this just recap. But so that's a snapshot of the paper.
Great. Sorry for interrupting you on the last
Okay,
second there.
not at all.
I wanted to just flag, as I said at the beginning, we do have this two-pager that I've just stuck in the chat. It's a Google Doc that you can use. I think I've condensed most of the points it's made for activists to talk about it, and so that you have lines to respond to people when they say, but what about PR letting the far right in? Which I'm sure we've all heard countless times. Yeah, over to
Brilliant.
questions.
Thank you, Stuart, for the presentation, and Lena, thank you for that short briefing as well. I'm sure that's going to be really useful because, yeah, as you say, this is one of the main myths that we've had to come up against time and again. The other one being instability, which that Make Votes Matter report, I think a year or so ago, managed to tackle. So the kind of list of arguments against us is dwindling. We've got about just over 10 minutes now for a bit of Q&A. If anyone's got any questions for Stuart or Lena, please feel free to use your digital or real hand and I'll go around. Sandy.
Yeah, just I mean, there are still some older of us who like to be able to read things in hard copy. Is this going to be available as a hard copy as well?
Yes, I have lots and lots of hard copies in the office. So if you send me an address that you wanted to send it to, I can definitely send you one next week. And or if I meet you at conference, I will be holding hundreds of them, and so I can see you there and give you one in person.
I think we can probably hand them out at the LCR stall at conference as well.
Fantastic.
Go on, Joe.
I have a question. Thank you. It's really interesting, and thank you for putting it together. It will be really useful. I would be interested just to hear what whether you talked to MPs about it and what sort of reaction they had, because I think, as you say, this is something that sort of there's a perception amongst the public who thinks about this stuff that PR can let in the far right, but it's definitely something we've heard echoed by MPs. So it'd be good to know sort of how it's landed with them.
Yeah, we've had we had a meeting with MPs yesterday and a couple of nice messages as well. I think broadly well. I think in general though, especially with people that are more party political, any idea that their own manifesto or their own commitments would be watered down isn't necessarily a welcome one, even though we're presenting it in the light of it helps temper extremist parties when they do get into power. But it has generally been really positive because I think that the Labour MPs, particularly who support PR, are looking for something that appeals to that kind of Labour-y instinct of this is going to, first past the post is going to help for reform at the next election. And the more evidence that we can give that statement and flesh that out, that's really helpful for them. I don't know if Stuart or Alex, you want to say anything else about the reception from MPs?
I think that largely, yeah, obviously, yeah, that I heard that as well. I suppose I was interested in I suppose how quickly we got into which system, which I suppose is a good thing on one hand, in that that people are thinking ahead, but equally that's just another difficult space, isn't it, to chart. So, but
and I'm sure Joe can go into like detail on what our plan is to address that issue. But I think across the various campaigning organisations in this space, we're doing a pretty good job of divvying up the various knotty issues that we're coming across.
Right.
Certainly from my perspective, talking to MPs, the far right and rise of reform is pretty heavy on people's minds. And I think having all these case studies now that we can point to of them being kept in check under PR systems is really useful, because in the toss up between having a few more reform MPs or having a reform majority government, or wacky result under first past the post in the next election where they are the lead partner in a dodgy coalition. I think working that out and seeing PR as the kind of preferable alternative in the scenario that we're in is really useful. Any other questions?
think we have a question from Anne Black in the chat. Anne, do you want to say your question? Sorry, you're on mute, Anne. It's hopefully asking you to unmute now.
All right, okay, now I'm being asked to unmute, I can. Yes, the Welsh Senate elections next year are going to use the same closed list system that the European Parliament elections used to use, and it's quite possible that Labour could end up behind Reform and behind Plaid. So it worries me that that risks discrediting PR as a whole, of all kinds. Have any thoughts on what happens if Wales goes really badly for Labour to the left?
Yeah, I think, thanks, Anne. This has definitely been a point of consternation and thought in the various different campaigning organisations, and we're working to make sure that that is a narrative that coming down the line in May we can counter. I recently spoke to Mark Drakeford on the Compass podcast and asked him this specific question of kind of what would he say to people saying that PR made it easier for Reform to win. And I'm going to just stick the link into that chat because I think he said it best. But essentially, when Reform is doing so well, the closed list system is the thing that he sees as denying them the majority that they might have had in the Senate, rather than a situation where they would have to share power. And also that the culture of shared power and coalitions in Wales is his hope that that would help mitigate some of their worst instincts as well in the Senate. So that's kind of, we are looking at it, and there's a specific answer about what we think is the effect of that closed list system, hopefully similar.
Thank you, Lena. I think also, just to add to that, it is a concern that I know that Welsh MPs have raised. I think we've been fairly clear as a campaign throughout that we're pushing for PR with a constituency link rather than kind of national lists and DONT and all the rest of that, which does go some way to making us look like the kind of reasonable median between the two options. Any other questions before I hand over to Joe? If not, that's okay. I think Lena will be contactable as well if you want hard copies of the report, or if you've got any other kind of follow-up questions. And Lena and Stuart, thank you very much for presenting. You're very welcome to stick around for the rest of the call, but you're also free to escape if you want to have the rest of your evenings. Joe, would you like to tell us about the campaign update?
Yeah, thank you again, Lena and Stuart. You've got an easy ride, but it was really interesting. So thank you very much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I'm just going to share my screen. Okay, hopefully you can all see that. But yeah, last time we had one of these campaign update calls was in May. It was in quite early May after the local elections, but before, well, some later developments in May, which we'll get onto. So I'm basically going to bring you up to date with everything that's happened since then. I mean, coming out of the May elections, we're in a moment of sort of real political volatility, and that's only increased. Shortly after that, we're able to announce that the APPG for Fair Elections is now the biggest APPG all-party group in Parliament, with 156 MPs from all parties. Most of those MPs, or most of the members, I should say, are Labour parliamentarians. So it's really encouraging, and it's really a testament to well, the work of Alex as our parliamentary organiser, but also the work that all of you have done over the years to get us to this point. It's a really sort of strong signal of how much support there is for electoral reform across the whole of Parliament, and especially on the government benches. Later in the month, we're able to sort of roll that announcement into a parliamentary event where we had speakers, including Professor Rob Ford, sort of exploring that volatility that was then really ramping up after local elections. We also heard from Alex Sobel, Labour MP, who's the chair of the APPG, as well as Abdesam Mohammed and Blair McDougall, along with cross-party MPs as well. Pretty positive event, and really sort of interesting contributions, really focusing on what this volatility means for democratic reform in general, particularly the voting system. In June, we had some really good news, which I'm sure you've all seen, that the British Social Attitude Survey, which is this long-running survey of public opinion, found we are now on record support for electoral reform. 60% of the public in favour, which, if you look out on a graph, is just sort of, it's switched places with support for first past the post if you look back in previous decades, and it's just at this unprecedented high, really sort of signalling that it is time for change. A majority of supporters of all major political parties now back change, which wasn't the case before. Previously, most Conservatives were still against, but apparently Conservative voters are now mostly in favour as well. And interestingly, according to John Curtis, who's very deeply involved in the British Social Attitude Survey, basically the people who have the lowest levels of trust in British politics, and we're at an epidemic of distrust in politics, the people who have the lowest trust are most likely to support reform, electoral reform, I should say. So it's seen by people who basically really fed up with the system as a way of fixing our democracy. That's really promising that there is this level of support out there. In July, and towards the end of July, we saw the end of the parliamentary sitting, and Parliament rose for summer, but there were a couple of really important things that happened before that came. Firstly, the devolution bill, or I should say the English Devolution and Community Empowerment Bill, to give it its full name, was published. That encompasses a whole load of things, local government reorganisation and so on, many other things too. But crucially for us, it means scrapping first past the post for mayors and police and crime commissioner elections. I mean, our response to this, campaign-wise, and what we're briefing and encouraging MPs to do, is basically to welcome the fact that the government is, completely acknowledging the first past the post doesn't work for these elections. The government is openly saying that the problem with first past the post for mayoral elections is it means you can get people elected on a small minority of the vote, which is true. What they haven't done is said that that also applies to general elections, which is a point we need to go on and make. So that's kind of how we're responding to that. The other really important thing, just before Parliament rose, is the strategy for elections was published. It's not a bill in itself, but it's basically the precursor to the widely anticipated elections bill, which is coming maybe later this year, maybe early next year. And this set out a whole range of things which the government wants to do on wider democratic reform, things like votes at 16, things like closing loopholes to do with donations, making voter registration easier, changing ID rules and so on. Much of it very welcome, but in total really insufficient to do what it set out to do, which is to give us basically safe and secure elections for the future. It's not going to do that if we keep first past the post, and heading into the next election, things are looking pretty ropey on current opinion poll levels. So again, I mean, using the fact that the government has conceded first past the post is broken and needs to be scrapped in some elections, we're encouraging MPs to make the point that it needs to be addressed in general elections as well. And there was what's called an urgent question in Parliament, when basically the minister was summoned to come and give a statement for elections, was questioned by MPs, and we had MPs from across the House, but also several Labour MPs, including Alex Sobel, also people like Rachel Blake and Scott Arthur, just really making that point. And it's great that the government's hearing this from multiple directions and multiple directions on the Labour benches as well. In August, I should just say very quickly, the democracy minister resigned, as you may have seen, Rushanara Ali, due to a sort of minor scandal to do with her homelessness brief as the democracy and homelessness minister. She hasn't been replaced so far. There may well be a reshuffle next week, so I'd expect someone to be appointed in that role, probably as part of that reshuffle, but we'll have to wait and see. Anyway, and then in September, which hasn't been going very long, but it's felt very, very busy so far. There's been a lot of developments already. Now, firstly, on Monday we published, or the APPG for Fair Elections rather published the terms of reference for a national commission on electoral reform. And I'm just going to talk about that a little bit, not in great detail. We have sent it out, we'll put it in the chat, have a detailed read of it, and do send any questions or comments you have about it. But just at a very high level, we've suggested a national commission for electoral reform back in November as part of the APPG did this launch report in November covering electoral reform, but also disinformation and dark money, which it also covers. For each of those three areas, it made one recommendation each, and the one for electoral reform was a national commission on electoral reform. Now, this that you can see on that second page is literally everything the report said about a national commission, just a very sort of high level description. And what the APPG has been doing over the summer is turning that into this. Hopefully you can see this this on your screen. Can you see that, Alex?
Yes.
Yeah, great. This is also a short report. It's, you know, an 8-page report. It's not got a huge amount of text, but it gives a fair amount more detail of what we mean by a national commission. Now, I should say this is something that isn't conceived as being the only means by which you could do a review of the voting system and look for alternative voting systems and so on. There's other ways you could approach it, and very conscious that if the government was to set up a review, it might not look exactly like this. But the aim here is really to show that there is a completely doable, robust way you can you know, do a commission on the electoral system quickly and effectively, and come to some useful conclusions. It tries to balance basically elements of a sort of traditional commission of the type that you might imagine the government is more keen on, with slightly more innovative, sort of deliberative democracy, bringing the public into the conversation, that sort of thing. And it was developed with input and consultation with a lot of experts. We spoke to all of these people listed in the acknowledgements in the front, some really sort of top tier academics and think tanks and constitutional experts. Not to say they have sort of formally endorsed this, but overwhelmingly the feedback was very positive, and you know, there's no showstoppers in the contents of the commission. Everyone's sort of very happy that it's a good approach. Right, I'll just say something very briefly about what the document has within it. It's got an officer's introduction, which is well worth reading. There's a sort of bit of rationale as to why we need a commission. The bit I want to focus on really is the purpose. And a really important element of what this does is it starts from first principles. You know, what actually do people want in a voting system in modern Britain, before going on to ask whether the current voting system works and whether there are better alternatives. And it's also, as well as those questions it's answering, it's also about fostering this national conversation about the electoral system and trying to sort of get a bit of a public debate going about changing how we elect parliament. We propose a structure which, as I say, combines independent commissioners, has a staff secretariat, an expert panel, sort of like the one they used in Wales for putting together their Senate reform proposals, and And then something we call a voters forum, which is that sort of public forum, which brings in a representative group of the public to talk about principles and values and so on. We square the circle of having this sort of top-down and bottom-up thing of basically having the commissioners as the executive of the whole commission, but by giving them a duty to make sure that their recommendations reflect the values and views and preferences of citizens. That's what their job is, to find out what the public thinks and then to answer the questions based on that. And the rest of it basically gives them everything they need in order to do that. Final thing I want to say is the timeline. This should take no more than 12 months. When you look at the Jenkins Commission, which was done back in the 90s, that took less than a year from launch to final report. The Welsh expert panel also took less than a year. This is perfectly doable within 12 months. It's not kicking it into the long grass. This is setting up something which we could see, we could all imagine the government setting up, it going away and answering the really tough questions which we need answered if we're going to move forward with electoral reform. So yeah, I will leave that with you. We'll make sure we send that out to you again, so you'll have it in front of you. And please do, you know, have a proper read and send any thoughts you have. But we'll also have questions in a moment. Now I'm just going to finish off the campaign update because we're not quite there yet. Final thing, in Parliament yesterday we had the second reading of the devolution debate. That's, you know, full debate of the principle of the bill at large, and we had I think nearly 10,000 people, supporters of cross-party organisations like Compass, Make Votes Matter, Open Britain and many others, asked people to write to their MPs to attend. Many did. There were loads of good contributions from all different parties, but there was particularly a really good contribution from a kind of a group of Labour MPs. And I'm just going to play a quick clip of that. And I'm hoping you'll be able to hear it.
We are asking our constituents to invest trust in their local leaders and to engage in local decision making with the hope that it can change something. I do think we must also take a microscope to the health of our democratic structures nationally. Turnout is down and it has been going down, and we know why. We keep hearing from folk on the doorstep they don't think their vote changes anything. I won't give way.
With the removal of first past the post for mayor and police elections, isn't it also time for a national commission on electoral reform?
As I was about to touch upon as a member of the all-party APPG for fair elections. This is why the provisions in the bill concerning voting systems are welcome, and why, as I will echo from my honourable friend, that we should consider a national commission on electoral reform. A commitment to foster a national conversation about how we should be elected in modern Britain and build consensus and a way forward. Different voting systems are already used across the country. For example, in devolved legislatures in Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, for our councils and for mayoral elections here in England. Disillusionment didn't start yesterday, and any change in a voting system won't solve the degree of disengagement we have seen in communities. But it could allow people to see their views always reflected in the institutions that represent them. To continue to rely solely on a voting system nationally, where nearly 2/3 of people want change, does risk crystallising this disillusionment. By formalising and extending devolution, the government today are moving to strengthen trust at a local level. By engaging in a serious exercise about how we are sent to this place, we could go a long way to renew it on a national level too.
The return of the supplementary vote system for mayoral elections is welcome and is a key feature of this important bill. And I associate myself with the views of my honourable friend from Falkirk on the wider issues of proportional representation.
So that was Ewan Steinbank, Simon Offer and Olivia Blake making the case for a national commission and for electoral reform in Parliament. I mean, it's just really welcome to see that being put to government ministers at a moment like that. And they're not the only ones who are talking about it. We've had some press about the launch of the National Commission in terms of reference. Polly Toynbee did an article which very conveniently brought together both the far-right report by Compass as a sort of why we need PR, with the National Commission terms of reference about how we get there, in a great article she put out, I think on Monday. And there's more coming, both in Parliament and sort of raising attention to this more publicly. As well as that, we're basically setting out this autumn to sort of socialise the concept of a national commission as widely as possible. So we got a parliamentary drop-in session where, you know, we sit in a room with some experts and MPs are able to just come and sort of find out more information at their convenience in a couple of weeks' time. We have fringe events happening at the Labour Party conference. Actually, there's a similar one happening at the Liberal Democrat conference, also about National Commission. And this is really just about that steady beat of building up, you know, this as a thing which the government needs to think about. And there's going to be, I think, increasing pressure and increasing sort of outside reasons why the government should be thinking about it. So I think I'll leave that there. We can say a bit about conference events and so on right at the end, I think, but that's basically where the campaign has got to at the moment.
Thanks, Joe. And it might also be worth us just sharing some of the press coverage